A great introduction can set you up for getting the best mark or review possible. So what's the difference between a bad introduction that's poorly written and hard to understand, and a great introduction that's well written and easy to understand? It turns out it's only 4 things. We need to highlight what is known, identify what is not known, explain why it's important to find that information out, and then provide a summary of what our study did to find that information. Most people struggle to write an introduction to a scientific report because they try and write it first when it should be the last section that we write. Except for an abstract, which is just a summary of your entire scientific report, but most undergrad reports won't actually need one, so just double check your assessment outline to see if you need an abstract. And we want to write our introduction last because we need the rest of the scientific report to tell us what to write in our introduction. We need to have written our methods to write our results, and we need to write our results, which is our data, to find out what our key findings are, which is what we write about in our discussion. And we need to know what our key findings are to find out what our study found, what it means, and why it's important. And we need to know why it's important because that is what we write about in our introduction. And we can use these 4 steps to write about it. And I'll walk you through a checklist at the end of this video that you can use when you come to writing your own introduction. Step 1 is to highlight what is known. And we start to do this by stating our area of research. The best way to do this is to use a strong statement sentence at the beginning of your introduction, and shorter sentences are ideal for this, between 10 and 25 words. This is also where we begin to provide information on the background and the current body of knowledge in our area of research. And that's because that highlights the relevance and importance of our study to the reader. One way that we do this is by using key citations relevant to our work. And we will have discovered most of these citations when we were writing our discussion. And there's 2 great ways that you can use citations in your introduction. The first is to use a key citation in a detail sentence, and the second way is to use a series of citations in a statement sentence. For example, Clark 2008 found that trees grew taller in wet areas because they had enough moisture to put their energy into growing. That's a citation linked with a detail sentence. Whereas we could say, many studies have found that trees grow taller in wet areas. And then in brackets, we could have Clark 2008, Johnson 2010, Smith 2012. So that's a series of citations following a statement sentence. It's great to mix it up and use both methods in an introduction because it helps highlight to the reader that we've done a review of our literature. And remember, the introduction is not a literature review. And yes, we should have done a review of the literature, but we're just trying to point out the key facts to our reader and not make them read a literature review themselves. And a great way to make sure that you've done this is to keep each paragraph on point with only 1 point per paragraph, and don't get stuck into listing a series of facts. This component of the introduction is also where we start to abbreviate any terms that we use throughout the rest of our scientific report. For example, I've done some research in the East African rift system. Now, rather than writing those 4 words over and over again throughout my report, the first time I write it in the introduction, I then abbreviate it in brackets afterwards, and I use the 4 letters EARS. Then, whenever I want to say East African rift system in my report, I just write EARS. It's much faster for me, and it's much easier for my reader to understand. Step 2 is to identify what is not known. Basically, we're explaining what the gap in our knowledge is. What is it that we don't know? Perhaps someone has done a study in one geographic location, but they haven't done it where you are. That's a gap in our knowledge. Or a survey has been completed with 10 to 15-year-olds, but not 15 to 20-year-olds. That's also a knowledge gap. It's also where we want to point out if other studies have identified the same knowledge gap. You can usually find this information in their future statements, which are in the conclusion section or sometimes at the end of the discussion. Step 3 is to explain why it's important to fill that knowledge gap. Saying no one has done it before is not a good enough reason. We need to explain why it's important. Maybe it has practical applications. For example, if some studies have shown how much fertilizer is best for a certain type of crop to grow well, but all of those studies were done in tropical regions where it's wet and warm, and no one has done the same study in a temperate region which is cooler and drier. Well, that shows why it's important to do that study, because we need to know how much fertilizer is best in all different types of climate to have the best crops possible. This is also where we should explain how we can fill the knowledge gap and not just why it's important. And remember, it might be obvious to you why it's important, but it's our job to explain that to the reader. And this is also where our introduction begins to get more specific, because in the beginning we're writing about our area of research, but now we're moving towards writing about our specific study. Step 4 is to provide a summary of what our study did to find that information out. And this should immediately link back to identifying why it's important to fill that knowledge gap. And we can do this by clearly stating our aims, research questions, and hypotheses. And there's 2 ways that we can do that. The first is by actually using the words aims, research questions, and hypotheses. And the second way is by simply stating what we did. For example, we hypothesize that this study aims to. We're actually using those words, and that makes it clear to the reader what we're talking about. Whereas the second way just states what we did matter-of-factly. For example, this study compared the application of different fertilizer amounts on young sugarcane plants in 2 temperate locations to determine the best fertilizer load for crop growth. It states what the study did and what it was trying to find out. But in most undergrad classes, you'll need to use the first way, and that's by using those aims, research question, and hypotheses words. And that's because your professor wants to see that you clearly understand what your study was about. So for example, you could write, we hypothesize that the best amount of fertilizer for sugarcane will be smaller in our study site than is used in tropical locations. And that makes it really clear to your professor that you know what you're writing about. Using these 4 things to write our introduction means the marker or reviewer can see that we know what our area of research is, we know what the knowledge gap is, we know why it's important, and that we can then explain what we did to fill it. Okay, let's go through that checklist now. We need to make sure that our introduction flows from broad to specific. First of all, we're writing about our research area as a whole before we move on to talking about the knowledge gap and then the specifics of our study. We want to make sure that we use active voice throughout the introduction. Active voice means our sentences put the emphasis on the doer and not the process. That's passive voice. It can be tricky sometimes to recognize the difference between active and passive voice, especially when we're writing. So I always recommend changing the grammar settings in your Word document to recognize them. That way your Word document will highlight when you use passive voice and you can come back and fix it later. And if you're not sure what the difference is, an example of this is, in this study we use tree height too. That's an active voice. We use, the emphasis is on the doer, us. Whereas passive voice would be, in this study tree height was used. Tree height was used, that's the process, so that's passive voice. We should also use present tense throughout the introduction. The only exception to this is if we need to write about how we answered the research question. For example, we collected 50 survey responses. Well, that's okay because the collecting part happened in the past, so it should be written in past tense. But everything else in the introduction should be written in present tense, so using words like is instead of was. We also want to make sure we use concise sentences, so that's short sentences that are really clear. Sentences shouldn't be longer than 50 words and ideally between 10 and 25 words. That will ensure our sentences are easy to understand and easier for us to write. We also want to double check that we've kept our paragraphs to 1 point each. And the best way to do this is by reading your first sentence in the paragraph and then reading the last and ignoring everything else in between. If those 2 sentences make sense together, that means your paragraph is on point. If it's not, have a look to see if you need to break up that paragraph into 2 paragraphs. Then we want to double check that we've highlighted what is known in our research area, identified what is unknown, explained why it's important to find that information out, provided the summary of our study, that we've included our aims and research questions, and that we've explained our hypotheses clearly to the reader. Now, if you're feeling frustrated or confused about writing a whole scientific report, then don't worry. It probably just means that nobody's ever explained to you before how to do one. And that's why you should watch this video next, because it might just change how you feel about writing a scientific report.